As people approach retirement, the dominant fear quietly changes. Earlier in life, the concern is usually about growth, how to earn more, how to accumulate faster, how not to fall behind. But near retirement, the real fear is no longer about missing upside. It's about losing control, losing dignity, losing the ability to choose calmly when something goes wrong. Most bad retirement decisions are not made out of greed. They are made under pressure. Pressure created by assets that look harmless, respectable, even intelligent, until the moment they demand action at the worst possible time. Charlie Munger understood this better than almost anyone. Instead of asking the comfortable question, "What should I own forever?" he preferred a far more uncomfortable one. "What increases my fragility when time becomes scarce?" That inversion changes everything, because many assets that were perfectly reasonable at 35 or 45 quietly become liabilities when recovery time disappears. There is a distinction most people miss until it's too late. The difference between financial return and life utility. An asset can deliver strong returns on paper and still be destructive to your peace, your sleep, and your judgment. Earlier in life, volatility feels like noise. Later, it feels like a threat. Not because the math changed, but because your margin for error did. Munger was famously uninterested in brilliance if it came at the cost of fragility. His focus was always on avoiding stupidity, especially irreversible stupidity. When you're young, mistakes are painful but correctable. When you're older, the same mistakes compound faster than wisdom. The asymmetry is brutal. Warren Buffett often said that time is the most powerful force in investing, but time is also the most unforgiving. Near the end game, it stops working in your favor. Errors accelerate, stress amplifies, and decisions made under emotional strain tend to be permanent. This is why retirement is not the moment to ask how much more you can squeeze out of your portfolio. It's the moment to ask what could corner you into a decision you never wanted to make. Forced selling, forced risk-taking, forced stress when health, energy, or clarity are no longer abundant. This conversation is not about pessimism. It's not about hiding from life or becoming overly conservative. It's about removing hidden sources of stress before they start dictating your behavior. It's about subtraction, not optimization. About choosing calm over cleverness. The most dangerous assets near retirement rarely announce themselves as dangerous. They don't look reckless. They look familiar, respectable, defensible. Often, they are things you've owned for years. That familiarity is precisely what makes them hard to question. Munger's mindset was simple and ruthless. Eliminate anything that can quietly push you into stupidity when you can least afford it, not because the asset is evil, but because your ability to recover is finite. As we go through these 5 assets, the goal is not to tell you what to buy or what to own. The goal is to help you recognize what no longer serves you psychologically, structurally, and morally as you approach a stage of life where peace matters more than performance. Because the real risk near retirement is not volatility, it's fragility. And fragility rarely looks dangerous until it's too late. One of the most dangerous moments in an investor's life is when ownership outlives understanding. Not because the asset suddenly became bad, but because familiarity quietly replaced clarity. Near retirement, this happens more often than people are willing to admit. At some point, you realize that you still own certain investments, not because you actively chose them, but because you never revisited them. You defend them instinctively. You remember why they once made sense, But if someone asked you today to explain calmly and precisely how they work, where the risks truly sit, and how they behave under stress, you would hesitate, not out of ignorance, out of distance. This is the invisible error, continuing to hold complexity out of habit, sunk cost, or pride. The position stays in the portfolio not because it is clearly understood, but because selling it would force an uncomfortable realization. I no longer have full command over this. Charlie Munger had little patience for this kind of self-deception. He warned repeatedly that complexity often acts as a refuge, not for intelligence, but for incompetence. Not because complex structures never work, but because they allow people to outsource understanding to narratives, labels, or authority. When things are going well, complexity feels like sophistication. When things go wrong, it becomes fog. Earlier in life, this fog is survivable. You have time, you have income, you have energy. If something breaks, you can learn, recover, adapt. Near retirement, that luxury disappears. Complexity doesn't just increase risk, it delays recognition. And delayed recognition is what turns small problems into permanent damage. What many people misunderstand is that the danger here has nothing to do with intelligence. Smart people are often more vulnerable to this trap because they once did understand the asset deeply. That past competence becomes a psychological anchor. I knew what I was doing when I bought this slowly turns into I must still know what I'm doing now. But time changes the equation. Markets evolve, structures mutate, rules shift, and more importantly, you change. Cognitive bandwidth is not infinite. Attention becomes more valuable. Mental energy becomes scarcer. What once felt intellectually stimulating at 40 becomes cognitively expensive at 65. This is where Munger's inversion becomes decisive. Instead of asking whether an asset is theoretically sound, you ask a more brutal question. How does this fail, and how quickly would I notice? Because near retirement, the most dangerous failures are not loud. They are silent. They erode optionality slowly, then demand action suddenly. Munger avoided derivatives and opaque structures not because they couldn't produce returns, but because they could fail quietly before they failed publicly. He had no interest in being right in theory while wrong in reality, especially not at an age where recovery was no longer guaranteed. There is also a moral dimension to this that people rarely discuss. Complexity near retirement doesn't just increase financial risk, it increases the likelihood of bad decisions under stress. When you don't fully understand what you own, every market movement feels ambiguous. Ambiguity breeds anxiety. Anxiety invites action, and action taken without clarity is how intelligent people destroy decades of discipline in a few emotional decisions. This is why complexity becomes dangerous precisely when life becomes less forgiving. Health issues appear. Family responsibilities resurface. Energy fluctuates. Sleep is no longer guaranteed. In that environment, assets that demand interpretation, constant reassessment, or specialized knowledge don't just cost money, they tax judgment. A simple test applies here, and it is uncomfortable by design. If you cannot explain, in plain language and without notes, what truly drives the risk of an asset, not the marketing story, not the historical return, but the real mechanism, then you no longer own it. It owns you. This is not about simplifying for the sake of simplicity. It's about recognizing that clarity is a form of margin of safety. Munger understood that wisdom often expresses itself through subtraction. Removing what no longer fits your cognitive and emotional capacity is not retreat. It is discipline. Near retirement, You are no longer optimizing for intellectual stimulation. You are optimizing for calm, control, and predictability. Assets that exceed your ability to audit quietly push you toward dependency on advisors, on narratives, on hope. And hope is a terrible substitute for understanding. The tragedy is that these assets rarely look reckless. They look respectable. They look sophisticated. They often come with impressive explanations and historical justifications. But respectability does not equal suitability, and sophistication does not equal safety. Munger's standard was simple: never own what you cannot calmly explain when things are going wrong, not when things are going right, when they are going wrong, because near retirement, the goal is not to impress anyone. It is to preserve autonomy, to avoid forced decisions, to keep your mental footing when markets, health, or life become unstable. Complexity you can no longer audit does not announce itself as danger. It whispers reassurance right up until the moment it demands clarity you no longer have. And by then, it's often too late. There is a quiet assumption many investors carry into retirement without ever questioning it. The assumption is this: if I survived volatility before, I can survive it again. On the surface, that sounds reasonable. Experience should create resilience, but in practice, the opposite often happens. Volatility does not age well. What people forget is that volatility is not just a mathematical phenomenon. It is an emotional demand, and emotional energy, unlike capital, does not compound over time. It depletes. Earlier in life, market swings feel abstract. You still have income. You still have time. You still have the option to correct mistakes with future effort. A drawdown is uncomfortable, but it is survivable. Near retirement, the same drawdown feels different, not because the numbers are larger, but because the context has changed. Health becomes less predictable. Energy becomes more precious. The ability to earn your way out of mistakes shrinks. The asset did not become riskier. Your exposure to its emotional cost increased. Charlie Munger understood that temperament, not intelligence, is the limiting factor in investing. And temperament is not static across a lifetime. Loss aversion intensifies with age, not in a clean, linear way, but contextually. When future income becomes uncertain or optional, losses feel permanent. The nervous system reacts before the rational mind can intervene. This is not weakness. It is biology and arithmetic working together. Near retirement, volatility starts demanding something most portfolios don't account for: sustained emotional endurance. The ability to watch large fluctuations without acting, without hedging impulsively, without doing something just to relieve discomfort. And here is the uncomfortable truth: an asset can have a positive expected return and still be psychologically uninvestable for you now, not in theory, in reality. Munger never confused mathematical correctness with human suitability. He knew that a strategy you abandon under stress is worse than a conservative one you can hold with discipline. This is where many experienced investors get trapped. They confuse knowledge with tolerance. They say, "I know this will recover," while their behavior tells a different story. They check prices obsessively. They adjust positions frequently. They lose sleep. Each small intervention feels rational in isolation, but collectively they erode long-term outcomes. The real problem here is not price volatility, it is decision volatility. A useful filter near retirement is not asking how much an asset moves, but how often it pushes you toward action. How often you feel the urge to intervene, to reduce exposure, to add protection, to explain the position to yourself again just to feel calm. Every time an asset demands emotional labor, it drains a resource that becomes increasingly scarce with age. That drain is invisible on account statement, but very real in life. History offers a sobering lesson. During the 2008 financial crisis, many seasoned investors exited equity markets near the bottom. These were not beginners. They understood cycles. They had read the books, but they were exhausted, emotionally depleted. They were managing careers, families, health issues, and market chaos simultaneously. Knowledge did not fail them. Endurance did. Munger would argue that the mistake was not owning volatile assets per se. The mistake was owning volatility that exceeded their emotional capacity at that stage of life. There is no shame in recognizing that capacity changes. There is only danger in denying it. Near retirement, the goal is no longer to prove toughness. It is to preserve calm, to avoid situations where fear or fatigue can hijack judgment. Assets that require you to be brave at the worst possible moment are misaligned with that goal. Volatility becomes especially dangerous when combined with declining attention and increasing life complexity. Market swings that once felt manageable start competing with medical appointments, family obligations, and the quiet fatigue of aging. In that environment, the emotional cost of volatility compounds faster than its financial reward. This is why Munger favored structures that allowed inaction. He valued the ability to do nothing, not as laziness, but as a strategic advantage. Assets that allow you to remain passive during stress preserve your decision-making integrity. Assets that demand courage under pressure quietly set traps. The mistake is not volatility itself. The mistake is overestimating your future emotional energy. Near retirement, you are not managing a spreadsheet. You are managing a nervous system. And the portfolio that respects that reality will always outperform the one that ignores it. Volatility that requires constant emotional endurance does not announce itself as danger. It looks like opportunity, like resilience, like strength. But strength late in life is not about enduring more stress. It's about needing less of it. Income is one of the most seductive words in investing, especially as retirement approaches. It sounds stable, predictable, reassuring. The idea of money arriving regularly feels like safety. But not all income is created equal, and some forms of it carry a hidden cost that only becomes visible with time. The cost is attention. Many income-producing assets quietly demand monitoring, optimization, judgment calls, and ongoing involvement. On paper, they look passive. In reality, they are anything but. They consume cognitive bandwidth, not in dramatic bursts, but through constant low-level vigilance. And near retirement, that kind of demand is far more expensive than most people realize. Charlie Munger was famously dismissive of investments that required constant activity. His advice to sit on your ass investing was not a joke. It was a recognition that forced action increases error rates. Every decision is an opportunity to be wrong, and the more frequently you must decide, the more often you expose yourself to mistakes. Earlier in life, this kind of engagement feels manageable. You have energy. You are used to juggling tasks. You are already in motion. Near retirement, the same assets start to feel heavy. They compete with other priorities: health, family, rest, and the simple desire for a quieter life. What once felt like involvement begins to feel like obligation. This is where inversion becomes essential. If an asset pays income but demands constant vigilance, it is not income. It is self-employment disguised as investing. The difference matters. True retirement-compatible income continues to function when you step back. It does not degrade when your attention shifts. It does not require frequent judgment calls to remain viable. If the cash flow weakens or disappears the moment you stop paying close attention, then you don't own an income stream. You own a job. Many people resist this conclusion because the income feels tangible. Monthly deposits create a sense of productivity. Letting go of them feels like giving up something real. But Munger would argue that this is a misunderstanding of risk. The real risk is not losing income. It is losing cognitive freedom. Assets that demand constant attention steal more than time. They steal clarity. They keep part of your mind occupied, alert, slightly anxious. That low-level mental noise accumulates. Over years, it erodes judgment and increases the likelihood of reactive decisions elsewhere in the portfolio. Real-world examples make this painfully clear. Many landlords discover too late that property management risk rises precisely when energy, patience, and health decline. Tenants don't become easier with age. Maintenance issues don't pause for medical appointments. Legal and regulatory complexity doesn't simplify itself. What once felt like a solid income stream turns into a source of constant friction. The problem is not that these assets are inherently bad. The problem is that they are incompatible with the phase of life in which freedom, not optimization, becomes the priority. Munger understood that the purpose of capital is not to keep you busy. It is to give you optionality. Income that chains you to ongoing decision-making does the opposite. It narrows your flexibility. It ties your well-being to your continued involvement. There is also a behavioral risk here that rarely gets discussed. When income depends on attention, people tend to ignore warning signs longer than they should. They rationalize small problems because the cash is still coming in. That delay often makes eventual exits more costly and more stressful. Near retirement, the best income streams are boring. They function quietly. They don't ask for updates. They don't demand explanations. They don't force you to stay sharp when life naturally slows down. This is not about laziness. It is about alignment. Your capital should serve the life you are entering, not the life you are leaving behind. Munger's mental model was brutally simple. The fewer decisions you must make to stay solvent, the safer you are. Assets that reduce the need for judgment preserve your most valuable resource, a calm, clear mind. If an income stream collapses the moment you step away, then it is not compatible with retirement. It might still be profitable. It might still look impressive, but it is structurally fragile in a phase of life where fragility is the enemy. Near retirement, income should buy you silence, not obligation. It should reduce mental noise, not add to it. And anything that fails that test deserves to be questioned, not because it failed, but because you are finally choosing to succeed differently. Some assets remain in a portfolio for a reason that has nothing to do with the future. They are held as a quiet negotiation with the past. The logic sounds patient, disciplined, even rational on the surface. I'm not selling at a loss. I'll wait until it gets back to my price. There's no point in locking in a mistake now. But beneath that language sits something else entirely: ego preservation. Charlie Munger was unusually blunt about this. He believed that many of the largest investment losses do not come from lack of information, but from the refusal to admit error. The human mind has a powerful need for coherence. It wants today's decisions to justify yesterday's choices. And when those choices turn out poorly, the mind looks for ways to postpone judgment rather than correct it. Near retirement, this tendency becomes especially dangerous. Earlier in life, holding on to a bad position can be rationalized as patience. Time still exists as an ally. Income continues. New opportunities can offset old mistakes. Near retirement, time no longer offers that buffer. What once looked like discipline quietly turns into risk concentration. Behavioral finance describes this as the sunk cost fallacy combined with consistency bias. But labels don't capture the lived experience. What actually happens is more personal. Your nervous system remembers the pain of being wrong. The idea of selling feels like reopening that wound. So you wait and wait and wait. The market, of course, has no memory. It does not know your entry price. It does not care how long you've held the position. It does not reward loyalty or punish regret. But your body remembers. Every time the asset moves, it reactivates the original mistake. That emotional charge never fully disappears. This creates a subtle form of mental taxation. You are no longer evaluating the asset objectively. You are managing a psychological account. And that account distorts risk perception. You tolerate downside you would never accept in a fresh decision. You ignore warning signs because acknowledging them would force action. Munger understood that this is how intelligent people trap themselves. They confuse endurance with wisdom. They tell themselves a story about long-term thinking when in reality they are avoiding a clean reset. A simple test cuts through this fog. If you had the equivalent amount of cash today, would you buy this exact asset at this size with this risk profile? Not something similar, not a better version, this exact position. If the answer is no, then the only reason you are still holding it is emotional inertia. Near retirement, emotional inertia is not a harmless quirk. It is a structural risk. Capital tied up in yesterday's errors cannot serve today's priorities. Worse, it occupies mental space that should be reserved for stability and clarity. Munger often emphasized that the biggest losses come not from ignorance, but from refusing to close mental accounts. People want their story to make sense. They want continuity. But markets reward adaptability, not consistency of narrative. There is also a moral dimension to this that rarely gets acknowledged. Holding positions to avoid admitting a mistake is a form of self-deception, and self-deception compounds. It bleeds into other decisions. It encourages rationalization. It erodes discipline. Near retirement, the cost of that erosion increases sharply. Stress tolerance drops. Decision fatigue rises. What could have been a clean, contained era becomes a persistent source of anxiety. Selling in this context is not quitting. It is not surrender. It is the act of restoring objectivity, of saying, from this point forward, my capital serves my future, not my pride. Munger believed that wisdom often shows up as the willingness to look foolish briefly in order to avoid being ruined permanently. Admitting a mistake early feels painful. Carrying it indefinitely feels familiar. Familiarity, however, is not safety. Positions held to protect the ego are the most expensive kind of assets. They cost not only money, but clarity. And near retirement, clarity is worth more than any unrealized rebound. Letting go is not about erasing the past. It's about refusing to let the past dictate the future. And that refusal, uncomfortable as it is one of the most rational acts an investor can make. One of the most subtle dangers near retirement comes from assets that look efficient, productive, and intelligent in normal conditions, but become unstable when life stops being normal. These assets don't announce themselves as risky. In fact, they often perform beautifully when everything is calm. That is precisely the problem. Charlie Munger's thinking always started with one brutal priority: avoid ruin, not maximize returns, not chase upside, avoid structures that break when pressure arrives. Near retirement, this priority becomes non-negotiable because the margin for recovery narrows to almost nothing. Many assets are optimized for average outcomes. They look good on spreadsheets. They behave well most of the time. But retirement is not lived in averages. It is lived along a path. And that path includes bad timing, health events, market stress, family emergencies, and moments where selling is not a choice but a necessity. This is where fragility reveals itself. An asset that performs well in normal conditions but collapses under stress doesn't just lose value. It removes optionality. It corners you. It forces action when you are least equipped to act. Munger understood that this kind of fragility is far more dangerous than simple underperformance. Near retirement, the real enemy is not volatility itself. It is path dependency. The order of events matters more than the average outcome. Two portfolios can produce the same long-term return, yet lead to radically different lives depending on when losses occur. Late-stage losses are not just numbers. They change behavior, they change decisions, they change sleep. This is why maximizing upside late in life is often a trap. The pursuit of higher returns tends to increase exposure to scenarios where recovery is no longer possible. What looks like ambition quietly becomes dependency on good luck, and luck is not a strategy. Munger rejected this way of thinking entirely. He preferred assets that allowed inaction under stress, assets that did not demand courage, heroics, or perfect timing. Because courage is an unreliable resource when health, energy, or emotional reserves are strained. A useful heuristic near retirement is simple. Prefer structures that let you be passive when things go wrong, not assets that require decisiveness at the worst possible moment. If an investment only works if you remain calm, precise, and brave during chaos, it is misaligned with the realities of aging. Fragility also shows up psychologically. Assets that increase fragility tend to amplify anxiety long before anything actually breaks. They sit in the back of the mind as a constant what if. What if markets freeze? What if liquidity disappears? What if I need access to this capital at the wrong time? That mental weight matters. It shapes behavior. It pushes people toward premature selling, excessive conservatism elsewhere, or compulsive monitoring. The portfolio might look efficient on paper, but it extracts a tax on peace. Munger believed that optionality is the true measure of wealth late in life. Not how much you can make, but how many bad scenarios you can survive without being forced into a corner. Assets that preserve optionality give you time to think, time to choose, time to wait. Assets that increase fragility do the opposite. They shorten your decision window. They remove flexibility. They turn ordinary stress into existential risk. Avoiding these assets is not about fear. It is about realism. Life becomes less predictable with age, not more. Designing a portfolio that assumes smooth conditions is a form of denial. Munger's philosophy was clear. Returns are meaningless if the structure breaks. No amount of upside compensates for a system that fails when life becomes unpredictable. Near retirement, the most valuable feature of an asset is not its return profile. It is its behavior under stress. Does it allow you to stay still? Does it preserve dignity? Does it let you avoid forced decisions? Assets that increase fragility steal freedom quietly. They don't collapse all at once. They erode optionality. until one day you realize there is only one move left, and it's a bad one. Removing them is not pessimism. It is preparation. Selling is often framed as failure, as an admission that something went wrong, as a retreat. Charlie Munger saw it differently. For him, selling was not surrender, it was subtraction. And subtraction, when done correctly, is one of the highest forms of intelligence. Near retirement, the objective quietly shifts. It is no longer about maximizing wealth at all costs. It becomes about minimizing forced decisions under stress, about designing a financial life where fewer moments require courage, speed, or emotional endurance. The greatest risk is not missing upside. It is being cornered. Every asset you remove reduces the number of scenarios that can push you into panic, confusion, or regret. This is not about becoming timid. It is about becoming deliberate. Munger understood that peace of mind is not a side effect of good investing. It is one of its primary outputs. Simplicity is often misunderstood as a lack of sophistication. In reality, simplicity is what remains after sophistication has been filtered by wisdom. As people age, cognitive biases don't disappear. They intensify. Daniel Kahneman made this point clearly. The solution is not stronger willpower, but better environment design. You don't rely on discipline to resist temptation. You remove the temptation. Selling the wrong assets is a form of environment design. It reduces the chances that fatigue, fear, or urgency will hijack judgment. It acknowledges a truth many resist. Aging changes how decisions feel, not just how they are calculated. The best portfolio near retirement is not the one that requires precision. It is the one that tolerates error quietly, one that allows you to be wrong without catastrophic consequences. Heroic correctness is fragile. Quiet survivability is robust. This is the final inversion. The question is not how much you can still make. It is what can take you out of the game before your time, what can force you into selling when you don't want to, what can steal your ability to wait. What you remove today determines how calmly you'll think tomorrow. Selling is not quitting. It is removing hidden enemies before they reveal themselves. If this way of thinking brought clarity rather than excitement, share this video with someone who values calm over noise. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, and activate notifications for future lessons inspired by Charlie Munger, not to promise returns, but to protect dignity, discipline, and long-term peace.